Welcome to the ART159 Graphic Design Layout course, lecture for the design principles. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at 4 of the basic principles that help to lead us through our design decisions as we will be working through the course and as we are progressing through our graphic design projects. Now, good design is C.R.A.P, and C.R.A.P being an acronym for 4 of the basic principles that we are going to be using throughout the entirety of this course. Now, in visual communication, there are many rules to learn, and it's hard to decide where to start, so sometimes it's easier to think about something simple and basic to begin with. Robin Williams, not the actor that you're thinking of, but the designer, who wrote a famous award-winning book, The Non-Designer's Design Book, promotes the idea of C.R.A.P in visual communication. But what does C.R.A.P mean and what does it stand for? Well, C.R.A.P stands for contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. Now, there are numerous articles and books written on the principles of design, and there are variations upon these principles. But this is the 4 basic principles that will really stand out and help you to guide through some of your basic design decisions, like I stated. We're going to look at each one of these principles one by one. And in the first project, you are going to begin to create a scavenger hunt where you will start to collect examples of these different principles in your everyday life. So these can be described as what is a good, clear, and readable design. They build a certain visual awareness. So let's say it once again. Good design is really C.R.A.P. These are examples by the designer Paula Scher, and they were created for the Public Theater poster series back in 1995 to promote different shows at the venue. And each one of the principles that we're going to be discussing is being used here. We can see in both of these examples contrast within the colors and the sizing and the spacing and the typography or fonts that are being used. We can see repetition within the space among those same elements. We can also see alignment of the different elements that are being used here, as well as the proximity of these different elements, and how all of these work together to create a cohesive design piece. So let's look at these one by one. The first principle we're going to be looking at is contrast. So how can we define contrast, and in what elements of design are they found? Well, we see contrast in our everyday lives, whether it's some sort of hazard sign to alert us, or potentially seeing contrast in images, such as product images, that might help us to focus on the product itself to potentially encourage us to buy that. So contrast in design is used to focus the viewer's attention and to highlight the most specific parts that they need to know. As such, graphic designers should use colors, text variation, shape, imagery, textures, and other tools that we have to contrast one another and have these elements stand out. Using contrast in a balanced way ensures that your design will be interesting, and it also helps to navigate the viewer through the space. So one way that we can use contrast is contrast in color. Now, color contrast in graphic design consists on playing with complementary color schemes to drive the viewer's eye through your design composition. Usually, the first look of the viewer will be the brightest part of your design, as it is more notorious than the darker color. So use it to create a focal point, adding to the most important elements of your design with that high contrast in color. It's also really important to choose the right color combination to create an eye-pleasing color contrast, because if you choose a wrong combination, it can be irritating and frustrating to the viewer. It's also important to avoid using colors too close to each other inside the color wheel if you want to create that contrast. If they are too similar, that contrast will not be very visible, and you will not obtain the results that you are looking for. One way to push the boundaries of the contrast of color is to use complementary colors. These are going to be colors that are found opposite each other on the color wheel, and are typically going to have a very strong contrast among one another. We can see different examples of these different color combinations of complementary colors and how they are being used in different designs still creating a pleasing harmony, but also creating points of emphasis within the design. Now, there is good and there is bad contrast, as we discussed. Just because we have two colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel doesn't necessarily mean that those are the best colors to be paired together for a specific design. When you read the sentence within these two different boxes here, the one on the left is using good contrast and the one on the right is using bad contrast. Now, the one on the right is still using complementary colors, but because the value of both of these colors are so close to one another, it creates a sense of vibration within the space and actually makes it hard for the viewer to read this and can be difficult for the viewer's eyes as well. On the left, we can see the contrast being used much more effectively, where we are able to read the text very clearly and it is able to be seen and visible against that darker background. There are tools that we can use as designers to help us throughout this process. The Adobe Programs has its own Adobe Color program that you can explore and see different color combinations within different wheels. You can see different color themes. You can customize those, and you can actually pull from some of these what we refer to as hex codes that are specific to the exact color that you are seeing on screen. Each one of these hex codes, which is always going to start with this hashtag, is going to be specific to that exact color and can be copied and pasted into your design programs to use the same color that you are viewing on your screen or within the application. This is another program that designers use called Coolers, and it is another site that allows you to see different color palettes that have already been created, and again pull from those color palettes to use within your own designs, or create variations off of those palettes, or customize or generate your own palettes as well. Coolers is a very interesting site, and if you go to the Coolers website, you'll notice that there is the Explore option up at the top that creates popular color palettes to explore. And there's also the Generate button, which actually allows you to hit your space bar and generate new colors that you can change, manipulate, or lock to come up with a pleasing color palette that you can use within your designs somewhat organically. Now, we also have contrast in size. Big versus small is a very simple example of contrasting sizes. Placing a large object or block of text beside a small object or block of text has an impact. The eye naturally is going to seek out the larger object and interpreting it as being more important often as well. This type of contrast adds interesting diversity to your composition, and it's especially useful when you're working with limited space. We refer to this as hierarchy within design, using the different scale of elements or the different size of elements to help the viewer to understand what is the most important or where you want them to look first, and what is the least important or where you want them to look second, third, and so on throughout the design. This is very common within design, and if you've ever written some sort of paper in any sort of word processing program, you've probably already explored your own sort of hierarchy. Maybe you made the title slightly larger or bold. Maybe you made the date or your name italic or slightly smaller, and then you made the body copy a certain size that would be legible throughout the entire paper as well. This is the same idea of using contrast of size to allow this form of hierarchy to help to deliver the message to the viewer more effectively. Contrast of shape is another tool that we can use. Creating a noticeably different shape at the key area of your design compared to the other elements in your layout can be effective to draw the viewer's attention. For example, if the majority of your design is made of areas shaped as squares, dropping in a circle will cause the viewer's eye to instantly gravitate to that. The human eye is soothed by similarities, but it's also intrigued by these appreciable differences. We can see a great example of this being used within the contrast of the different shapes of this program for the University of Arts in London. They have 5 different programs here that are using unique shapes that are both being echoed on the printing surfaces and also being die cut out of the program to create this sort of system within the identity of the brand. Contrast of typography or different letter forms within your design is another way to use this. As a graphic designer, much of your work will involve some type of font. Color, size, and shape can be applied to typefaces. And when we talk about typefaces, we're simply talking about the letters and the fonts that you are using within your work. So for unification, it's best to stick with one or two different typefaces within a layout, and then use style variations within those typefaces. So for example, try the light, the regular, and bold styles to create contrasting effects within a single typeface. And then choosing colors that complement your overall color scheme is another technique for making these sections stand out. And we can see how these begin to build upon each other. We see two different examples here where we can see this contrast in typography as well as color and size within these spaces. All of these are working together to create a harmonic hierarchy within the design and help to lead the viewer's eyes from one part of the design to the other, letting us know what the significance is of each one of these parts of the design as well. Now, in the beginning, as you are starting as a designer, it is best to, again, not use too many different typefaces within your design. Usually 1 to 2 typefaces and then variations within those typefaces is an effective way to use that. Here on the right, we can see that we have a single typeface that has different styles in that typeface. Up here we can see the O7 and the D and the B. These are condensed versions of this typeface. Then we can see bold versions of this typeface being used. We can see the regular version of this typeface being used in a smaller scale. These are all the same typeface, just different styles of that typeface that achieves that same sort of contrast, but still creates that sense of rhythm and harmony within your design as well. So that is looking at the first principle of contrast and looking at the ways that we can use that within the different color choices that we are using, within the different size that we are using, and within the different font or typography that we're using as well. Next, we're going to look at repetition, which is the next principle of the graphic design's C.R.A.P acronym that we are going to be looking at. So what are things that may be repetitive or based on repetition, and how can we define this within design? Well, again, you may have some sort of routine that you go through every morning before school or before work, and this is a sense of repetition. Or you may go to a local theater and the seats will all be in some sort of gridded rows and columns that make it easy to find where you have purchased your ticket and where you're going to be seating for that movie. We also see repetition used a lot within architecture to create this sort of balance within the overall structures that they are working on. Now, repetition in design will not only create a better flow in your graphics, but can also help to emphasize the message. For instance, repeated shapes or colors draw more attention and become more visible to the viewer. Isolating one of those elements can draw emphasis to that particular part of the design. And we're seeing this being used very effectively here on the left with this turn off the light. This sense of repetition of all of these bulbs being the same color and the same size, and this single light being on draws our eyes towards that specific element. Over here we can also see this use of repetition within the actual typeface itself. This use of these organic forms and this similar color palette that is being used to create these different letter forms creates a sense of repetition, even though each one of these letter forms is slightly different from the one next to it. Furthermore, repeating certain design elements will help to bring consistency and familiarity for the viewer. So repeating features throughout the design to create a visual connection can help to establish a strong brand style as well. This can also be seen within many publication designs. Oftentimes, if you open up a magazine and there is a content section, you'll notice that there is a sense of repetition, maybe within the different headers that are being used, or the subheaders, or captions, the way the body style is being used, the colors of the typography, and even the placement or sizes of different images that are being used to create this sort of system within the space. There's variation and there's contrast within these elements, but they have created this sort of system, and they're choosing these different elements that will work in all of these different variations, in this case, of these different numbered areas of these road stops that they're referring to. The next principle that we're going to look at is alignment. And what is another way that we can define this within design thinking? Well, if you've ever had any sort of junk drawer, and I'm sure all of us are guilty of that, then you know that it's kind of a mess, right? It's where we dump everything and when we don't know where else to put it. Now, if we get some sort of organizer for that maybe has similar sizes among the different widths and heights, we can very quickly see how we can use alignment to create that sense of organization within that same junk drawer. Over here on the right, you may have seen references or images like this in the past for different publications or websites, maybe some sort of style guide. This is referred to as knolling, K-N-O-L-L-I-N-G. And it is simply the idea of taking different elements and creating a structure of alignment among those elements to be able to see all of them in one place in a cohesive space. Now, alignment in design means to order and organize elements within a page or on a screen or whatever it is that you are applying your design to. It means that a piece of text or a group of objects can be aligned to either the right, the left, the center, the top, or the bottom. Whatever you go for, use just one type of alignment for the majority of your elements. So, for example, if you are using center alignment, then you want for the majority of the elements to be center aligned in the elements that are going to be used within that same space. Over here on the right, we can see a variation where we have some that are center aligned and also some that are being left aligned. And if we were to take a guideline and draw it from the bottom here all the way up to the top, we'd notice that these are not just arbitrarily placed within the poster, but they're actually considering the alignment of these different elements at the bottom and at the top right of this poster. And that creates a very balanced effect for the viewer. This principle is mostly used with text, although depending on the picture you are creating, there are plenty of other uses for this as well. Alignment helps to guide the eye towards what the audience needs to look at first, second, and third, and it simply helps to organize this space so that it's easier for us to navigate that as well. When using alignment, if you are using text on a poster, for example, you want to put the most important information at the top, because typically the eye is going to start at the top and read left to right here in the United States. Now keep that in mind when placing text or similar objects. Keep the alignment to the left or right. Center is okay occasionally, but if you align everything to the center, your picture or poster could potentially look weak and lose some of that dynamic balance that you are striving for. It really depends on the situation, and that is where the best design solution is going to come up for your design problem. Now we can see different variations of alignment being used here as well over on the left, where we can see some vertical alignment that is working within the different spaces here. And we can also see alignment being used on different axes over here on the right. Now, these are common axes of approximately, say, 30 or 45 degrees, that these are all moving along, even though there is a sense of rotation in the space. But one thing that this can do within this sense of alignment among this common axis is really start to activate your design and create a much more dynamic sort of balance to your design as well. Now, the last principle that we're going to look at is proximity. And how can we relate proximity to design? Well, I'm sure we all remember COVID happening a few years ago and the initial 6 feet distance that we were intended to keep from one another. This was the idea of proximity among one another and how we can help to potentially decrease the spread of the disease. Now, this same sort of idea of proximity can be used within design as well, right? Take, for example, if you were walking in a park and you see 2 people sitting on a bench. If they're sitting on opposite ends of that bench, sort of facing away from each other, you're probably going to assume that they don't know each other and they're both just stopping at a common bench. If you walk past that same bench and the 2 individuals are sitting next to each other, maybe in the center or on one side of the bench, you might assume that they do know each other, whether they are talking with one another or looking at each other or not. that sense of proximity within their personal space, makes us make some certain assumptions about that. And the same sort of thing happens in design as well. Proximity is about grouping objects and placing them either far away or close to each other to create these different sort of relationships. So for example, contact information on a business card should all be placed together. You wouldn't want to look all over for the information that you are trying to find for the individual's name, phone number, email, and so forth. You'd want to keep all that contact information together so that when they are ready to reach out, they can do that effectively. And we can see that used in many examples of design, right? Really, proximity comes down to the placement of these elements and the grouping of the elements with common relationships among themselves. Now, this also works in tandem with the idea of hierarchy. What do you want the viewers to look at first, second, and third? And what information belongs together within that space? If the information is related to one another, then you want to group that information. If the information is potentially slightly different, then you would want to separate that information as well. Proximity is all about building relationships between design elements and showing what belongs together. And this is why it is not well perceived to have a lot of chaotic objects in one piece. Moreover, design elements that do not belong together should be clearly separated from each other. Grouping them might be rather confusing to viewers. So avoid sticking objects or pieces of text in different corners of the design and try to find relationships among the alignment and the proximity of those. This should be done in any sort of professional visual material. And we can see this being used here within these different posters for bands or shows. The artists are being grouped together, or the style of music, the location is being grouped together down here. On the right-hand side, again, we can see the different groups that are going to be played together within the same proximity. The date being used down here alongside the month and the year. The time being positioned around this space as well. This is all information that belongs together, where the name of the actual event can be separated from that potentially to draw some sort of emphasis to that. So in summary, we have our 4 basic design principles of C.R.A.P. Contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. This is a very convenient designer's tool that you can apply to all types of visual work. And by learning these 4 basic principles, you can build some sort of visual awareness that will help you identify design problems and deal with them on your own. These are some different examples of contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity, and how these are being used within design, and can be helpful to refer back to as you are working on your future projects within the course. Coming back to the original example that we looked at from Paula's share, we can again see examples a little bit more clearly now of these principles of C.R.A.P, right? Contrast in color, contrast in size, contrast in the style of the single typeface that they're using for this. We can also see repetition of these different colors being used, as well as the different sizes and the different styles of that typeface. We can see repetition of the sort of imagery that is being used and the style of fonts that are being used, even between these 2 posters. There's, of course, alignment going on within both of these posters. Some of them are using vertical or horizontal alignment, while others are following a common axis among the actual imagery that we're seeing that is creating alignment with the actual image itself. And then we can also look at the proximity, how they are placing this information. Now, in this example, this is intended to almost seem kind of chaotic, right? It's really intended to fill up the entire space, but they're still thinking about how they can group this information together to make it so that even with those visual effects, we're still able to walk away with the information that is needed. So over here on the right-hand side, we can see that they have these different reviews for the pieces that they are grouping together throughout the colors of the text and the different alignments that help us to separate one from another. Then they're placing all the information that's very important to actually go to or call up or visit this place so that you do not have to go through and try to decipher that within the actual design. These are very, very strong examples of contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity that are used in a sort of system that was used for this public theater. And we can see how this can be used very effectively within your own designs as well. If there are any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and please make sure to refer to the tutorial video for this module as well.